Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're parting the mists of time and probably swatting away a lot of historically accurate biting insects to delve into the world of ancient Gaul. Forget the noble savage cliches. We're here to explore why the life of a revered figure, the Celtic Druid wanderer on a sacred pilgrimage, was often less about serene mystical wisdom and more about damp feet, suspicious stares, and trying very hard not to get inconveniently sacrificed or crucified. Prepare for a journey through sacred groves that were anything but peaceful retreats. You've seen them in fanciful illustrations, perhaps whispered about in half-remembered legends. The wise, enigmatic Druid, clad in robes white as driven snow, a logistical nightmare by the way, communing peacefully with ancient oaks, maybe dispensing cryptic advice to troubled chieftains. They stand there eternally calm, bathed in the soft, dappled light of a pristine forest, looking profoundly knowledgeable about, well, everything. The quintessential wise man of the woods. Let me disabuse you of that notion right now. Being an actual wandering druid in ancient Gaul, especially during the turbulent times when Rome decided it rather liked the neighborhood, and various local tribes were expressing their disagreements with sharpened bits of metal. It wasn't a gentle seminar on natural philosophy. It was damp. It was dangerous. It was often bewilderingly uncomfortable, politically treacherous, and involved far more stumbling through brambles and sleeping on cold, wet ground than anyone ever carved onto a standing stone. It was, for most who undertook such journeys with any regularity, profoundly, existentially, sucky. Forget serene communion. Think persistent low-grade anxiety punctuated by moments of sheer terror and the constant nagging dampness that seeps into your very bones. The sacred groves were sacred, perhaps, but getting to them and surviving between them, that was the real test. A brutal pilgrimage measured in aching muscles, suspicious glances, and the ever-present possibility of blundering into a Roman patrol or a tribal skirmish that had absolutely no time for your intricate understanding of the lunar cycle. Now, before we fully immerse ourselves in the misery, the experience, of our wandering druid, if you appreciate these dives into the less glamorous side of history, please do take a moment to like the video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. Ringing that notification bell helps ensure you don't miss our next exploration of historical discomfort. And please, share your thoughts or any particularly grim historical travel facts you know in the comments below. Community makes the misery, well, slightly more communal. We appreciate your support more than our druid probably appreciated finding a dry spot to sleep. All right, find yourself a comfortable spot. Maybe pour yourself a warm drink, a true luxury our druid could only dream of between bouts of questionable fermented beverages. Settle in. Try to ignore the modern comforts surrounding you for a moment. Let the sounds of your civilized world fade. We're heading back nearly 2 millennia into the dense, fog-shrouded forests and treacherous pathways of ancient Gaul. Prepare to walk a mile, or rather hundreds of agonizing miles, in the probably not very waterproof footwear of our Celtic Druid wanderer. Let's begin the pilgrimage. So, how does one become a wandering druid, tasked with tending the spiritual health of the land and its people, while simultaneously dealing with leaky skies and leaky neighbors? It probably wasn't through filling out an application form or responding to a posting carved on an oak leaf, meticulously detailing your qualifications in advanced omen interpretation and proficient mistletoe harvesting. No, the path to druidhood, particularly the itinerant kind, was less a career choice and more an absorption, an inheritance, or perhaps even a sentence handed down by fate or family. More likely, our druid didn't so much choose this path as he was identified, singled out, perhaps due to a perceptive comment made as a child, an unusual sensitivity to the rhythms of the forest, a knack for remembering lengthy stories, or maybe just being the third son of a family already deeply embedded within the druidic tradition of his tribe, be it the Ayadui, the Arverni, the Sequani, known for their fierce pride, or one of the myriad smaller clans constantly vying for status and survival in the complex mosaic of Gaul. Forget visions of noble destiny whispered on the wind. Think more along the lines of, well, someone's got to learn all this stuff, and you seem slightly less likely to set the village on fire than your brothers. No silver spoon awaited you, no guarantee of comfort or even basic security. A life of easy contemplation in a well-provisioned, centrally heated sanctuary. Keep dreaming. Your inheritance wasn't fertile land or herds of cattle. It was an immense, daunting, unwritten library of oral law, intricate ritual knowledge passed down through countless generations, a sophisticated understanding of astronomy needed to govern the calendar, detailed botanical knowledge, the complex genealogies of local chieftains, get those wrong at your peril, and the even more unpredictable currents of tribal politics and simmering resentment. Your metaphorical swaddling cloths might have been woven with the pervasive scent of damp earth, the tang of wood smoke that clung to everything, and the faint metallic background hum of blood from animal sacrifices, one devoutly hoped most of the time, though rumors about the old ways always lingered, especially in Roman propaganda. Forget gentle lullabies. Your earliest auditory memories might have been the monotonous, hypnotic drone of elders reciting genealogies that stretched back to mythical ancestors, the complex cadences of legal precedents, or the haunting verses of epic poems detailing the triumphs and tragedies of your people. All to be absorbed, memorized, perfectly. Because writing? That was for lesser minds, for merchants counting beans, or worse, for those overly practical record-keeping Romans. Committing sacred knowledge to perishable material? Utterly vulgar. Besides, it kept the secrets safe, locked within the approved minds, away from the unworthy or the actively hostile. Your brain wasn't just for thinking. It was the tribe's hard drive, encyclopedia and law library, all rolled into one. From the moment you could walk without habitually falling into the cooking fire, a surprisingly high bar in some households, your education, or rather, your initiation, began. And let's be crystal clear, this wasn't some gentle, nurturing pedagogy focused on self-discovery. This was immersion, often cold and sharp, into the harsh realities of the world you were being trained to interpret, influence, and survive. By age 7 or 8, an age when other Gallic children might be learning the finer points of throwing dung, mastering the art of the insult, or perhaps practicing how to incompetently wield a miniature wooden spear, you were likely already an apprentice. Not in name, perhaps, but in function. Cheap, observant, expendable labor tagging along with a practicing druid, maybe an uncle whose joints hadn't quite seized up yet, a stern cousin known for his encyclopedic knowledge of poisonous fungi, or a designated master chosen by the community elders. You were the fetch and carry boy, the fire watcher, the sample gatherer, the silent observer absorbing everything through wide, often intimidated, eyes. Your toys? Forget charmingly carved wooden animals or knucklebones. Your toys were the landscape itself and its complex contents. Learning to identify not just 10 or 20, but hundreds of plants, distinguishing the one that eases fever from the one that stops the heart, the one that aids visions from the one that causes agonizing blisters, the edible root from its deadly look-alike growing just inches away. You learned this not from illustrated charts, but from direct demonstration, often accompanied by warnings so dire they'd curl your hair. Chew on this leaf, boy, and you'll be seeing your ancestors by sunset. This one, however, might just stop your cousin's bleeding if you mash it correctly. You learned the feel of different barks in the dark, the smell of different smokes, the subtle signs of animal tracks. You learned to handle a small curved sickle, often bronze, its edge precious and easily dulled, not for harvesting waving fields of grain, that was peasant work, but for the precise, ritually prescribed cutting of mistletoe from a sacred oak, never letting it touch the ground. or gathering potent herbs only found clinging to precarious cliff edges or deep within murky swamps, all while murmuring the correct invocations under the correct phase of the moon, because cosmic alignment and proper respect were crucial. Get it wrong, and at best, the plant's virtue was lost. At worst, you'd angered a spirit, or more practically, failed the task and earned yourself extra chores or a cuff to the head. Your playground? Certainly not the village square or a sun-dappled meadow. It was the deep, often intimidating forest where the light struggled to penetrate the canopy and silence could feel heavy, watchful. It was the windswept, desolate hilltop designated for observing the solstice sunrise, shivering in the pre-dawn chill while your master made meticulous calculations based on horizon markers. It was the sucking, treacherous bog where rare medicinal plants grew and where a single careless step could see you sink up to your knees, or worse, in cold, foul-smelling muck that seemed determined to steal your shoe. While other children were learning the rhythms of farming, or the brutal calculus of warfare, you were mastering the intricate, unwritten lunar solar calendar, learning to track the complex movements of constellations across the vast, often cloud-choked night sky, committing those endless genealogies, laws, and epic poems to your overburdened memory. A single mistake in recitation could earn you days of fetching water or mucking out the sacred enclosure. Fun games were less hide and seek and more practical, terrifying exercises, like spot the edible fungus from the instantly fatal one, no second chances. Recite the entire lineage of Chieftain Thunderfist, including all 7 wives and their notable offspring without stammering. Find north using only tree bark and ant hills, while blindfolded. Just kidding, mostly. And the perennial favorite. Endure hours of silent meditation while being devoured alive by midges without twitching. Twitching shows lack of spiritual discipline. Failure wasn't met with gentle correction and encouragement. It might earn you a sharp rap from a staff that seemed permanently attached to your mentor's hand. A period of punitive fasting. Hunger sharpens the mind, boy, and reminds you not to mistake hemlock for wild parsley again. Or simply the cold, heavy silence of your master's disappointment. A silence that spoke volumes about the crushing weight of the traditions you were expected to embody. Your primary instructor in this open-air, often damp school of hard knocks was likely an older druid, perhaps your own father if he followed the path, or more commonly a senior figure within the local order, chosen for his knowledge and severity. Let's stick with Brennus the Stern, not because Gallic names lacked variety, but because his face probably looked like it had been carved from a block of weathered granite by a particularly dyspeptic earth elemental. His expression rarely shifted from a kind of neutral severity, occasionally dipping into outright disapproval, his eyes sharp and missing nothing, from a misplaced foot during a ritual step to the flicker of fear in your own eyes. His vocabulary was likely as sparse as genuinely dry firewood during the seemingly endless rainy season, consisting mainly of monosyllabic grunts, pointed gestures towards the object of your current incompetence, specific intoned verses delivered with resonant authority, and the occasional, devastatingly precise critique of your inadequate understanding of omens. The birds flew left, boy, left, towards the unlucky mountain. Only an idiot or a Roman sympathizer would see good fortune in that. Or your sloppy ritual technique. Your chanting sounds like a dying goat. Again, and put some spirit into it. He taught you everything not through patient Socratic dialogue, but through relentless observation. Watch, learn, don't distract me. Rote imitation, do it exactly as I do, no flourishes. And correction, that often felt less like pedagogy and more like being perpetually audited by a deeply unimpressed cosmic entity. You learned the profound importance of silence, not just keeping your own mouth shut, but listening intently to the world around you. The subtle shift in the wind's direction, the specific cry of a raven, warning, territorial dispute, just bored, the crackle and spit of a fire, revealing the quality of the wood, predicting weather changes. These weren't poetic abstractions. They were data points crucial for survival and divination. Was that sound a foraging boar, a Roman patrol moving with disciplined quiet, or just the nervous indigestion of the chieftain you were about to advise on declaring war? Critical distinctions, taught through experience, often the hard, embarrassing, or painful way. Any glimmers of warmth or overt kindness from Brennus were as rare as hen's teeth, perhaps manifesting as a fractionally less severe grunt after you successfully navigated a particularly tricky social negotiation between two feuding families, or correctly identified a rare herb needed for a potent remedy. These weren't expressions of affection. They were minimal acknowledgments that you hadn't, just this once, been a complete disappointment. They were small, hard-won victories in a long, demanding apprenticeship, designed not just to impart knowledge, but to forge resilience, discipline, and a profound acceptance of hardship as the baseline condition of the path you now walked. A path chosen for you, perhaps, but one you now had to tread, ready or not. Now let's talk about the daily reality of this wandering druid on his sacred, yet relentlessly arduous pilgrimage. What did a typical day, or more accurately, a typical stretch of days strung together, like damp, uncomfortable beads on a string, actually look and feel like? Forget any romantic notions of serene contemplation punctuated by effortlessly delivered, insightful pronouncements beneath sun-dappled oaks. Think instead of relentless forward motion, grinding physical effort, pervasive environmental hostility, and a profound, soul-deep lack of basic comforts, all wrapped in a general miasma of anxiety. Holidays, weekends off, paid leave for spiritual recharging, and perhaps a nice soak in some hot springs. Absolutely adorable concepts, likely to provoke a hollow laugh from our druid, but about as common in his world as finding a Roman centurion genuinely interested in discussing the subtle symbolism of oak versus ash trees, without an ulterior motive involving timber contracts or strategic deforestation. The sacred groves didn't keep office hours. The paths between them, assuming paths even existed, certainly didn't maintain themselves, and the need for ritual observance, dispute mediation, or simply putting distance between yourself and potential trouble didn't conveniently pause for inclement weather, personal fatigue, or inconvenient boils. The road, or more often, the barely discernible animal-trodden track through the woods, didn't take breaks, and neither fundamentally could you. A day, assuming it wasn't violently interrupted by something truly exciting, like stumbling into the middle of a tribal skirmish, or being mistaken for a runaway slave by a Roman patrol with an arrest quota, likely began in the blackness before the first hint of dawn tried to paint the perpetually gray or misty Gallic sky. You wouldn't be woken by a gentle alarm chime or the smell of brewing coffee. No, your alarm clock was more likely the insistent, damp cold seeping up from the unforgiving ground through your cloak, finding every gap in your clothing. Or perhaps it was the high-pitched, infuriating buzzing of a cloud of midges discovering the warm buffet that was your exposed face. Or maybe just the chorus of groans from your own muscles and joints, protesting the resumption of hostilities after a brief, inadequate ceasefire. Consciousness returned not with a gentle drift, but often with a weary sigh and the immediate, depressing awareness of the day's labors stretching ahead. First, a cautious assessment of the surroundings in the dim light. Were there any immediate threats nearby? Had anything large and toothy investigated your campsite overnight? A quick, furtive relief behind the nearest bush, hoping it wasn't poison ivy, sacred mistletoe ground, or directly upwind from your sleeping spot. Then, gathering your meager possessions, rolling up the damp cloak, shaking out the debris and perhaps a few disgruntled insects, checking the contents of your leather pouch. Was the flint still dry? Had mice gotten into the pitiful stash of grain? Securing it tightly. Breakfast? If you were lucky, exceptionally lucky, it wasn't just a memory. It might be a handful of dried, slightly sour berries foraged the day before, their sweetness long gone, or a chunk of stale, gritty flatbread saved from a previous host, now possessing the texture and flavor of baked earth. Maybe just tightening your belt and taking a long draught of cold, slightly metallic-tasting water, scooped from a nearby stream, after carefully checking upstream for dead animals, naturally, and trying not to think too hard about what might be lurking unseen in the depths. Then, gripping the familiar worn smoothness of your staff, shifting the weight of your pouch, and facing the path ahead. It was straight to the primary mode of labor, walking. Endless, slogging, unglamorous walking. Hours of it. Putting one foot wearily in front of the other, staff in hand, its tip probing the ground ahead, testing for hidden roots, loose stones, or patches of mud eager to suck you down. Your eyes constantly scanning. The path for immediate obstacles. The trees for familiar landmarks or subtle omens. Was that flicker of movement a squirrel or something more significant? The quality of the light, the shape of the clouds, the surrounding woods for any sign of movement that might signal danger, or, almost as bad, other people. You walked through tangled undergrowth that clawed at your clothes, forcing you to push through dense thickets of hazel or bramble that left long scratches on your arms and legs. You navigated rock-strewn slopes where every step threatened a twisted ankle, your staff essential for balance. You trudged across seemingly endless stretches of marshland, trying to pick a path across tussocks of grass, inevitably misjudging and plunging a foot into cold, stinking water that filled your worn leather shoe with vile ooze. Crossing rivers often meant finding a shallow, freezing ford, the current tugging at your legs, the smooth stones treacherous underfoot, or perhaps balancing precariously on a slippery, moss-covered log bridge left by previous travelers, or deciding it looked too rotten and opting for the freezing weight instead. You'd walk as the sun climbed, assuming you could even see it through the dense forest canopy or the perpetual drizzle that seemed to be Gaul's default weather setting. You'd walk through the sticky, humid heat of midday in summer, swatting incessantly at the clouds of flies drawn to your sweat, feeling the damp wool of your tunic cling unpleasantly to your back, the air thick and heavy. You'd walk as the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, spooky shadows through the trees, pushing yourself, muscles screaming, to reach a marginally less exposed or ominous-looking spot to make camp before full darkness fell, bringing with it colder temperatures and unseen nocturnal dangers. Breaks were purely functional, snatched moments, not leisurely rests. A brief stop to drink deeply from your water skin or directly from a stream. To relieve oneself hastily behind a bush, always checking for snakes first. Maybe to quickly munch on whatever scant, unappetizing provisions remained, leaning wearily against a tree trunk. There was no packed lunch, no scenic picnic spot, no afternoon tea break with biscuits. Just relentless, forward movement, driven by the need to cover ground, to reach the next known grove, the next potential source of uncertain hospitality, or simply to put more distance between yourself and whatever real or imagined unpleasantness might be behind you. The sheer physical endurance required was immense, not the explosive strength of a warrior, but the quiet, grinding, stubborn stamina of a pack animal, born of absolute necessity. And the environment itself? Oh, it wasn't just a passive backdrop. It was an active, often malevolent participant in your daily struggle, a capricious entity that seemed to take personal offense at your presence. The great forests of Gaul, the deep Ardennes, the tangled woods of Armorica, the oak-dominated heartlands, weren't the welcoming, cathedral-like spaces of fantasy. They were vast, complex, often gloomy wildernesses. Ancient, gnarled trees towered overhead, their canopy so thick in places that it created a perpetual twilight, their roots writhing across the path like petrified snakes waiting to trip the unwary or lame the careless. Thorny vines, nature's barbed wire, snagged at your clothes and skin with malicious precision. Progress could be agonizingly slow, forcing you to hack through curtains of ivy with a small knife. or detour for miles around impenetrable thickets of blackthorn or wind-fallen giants that had crashed across the track like roadblocks erected by angry gods. Then there were the swamps and marshes, beloved by legions of biting insects and lurking diseases, their surfaces often deceptively covered with bright green vegetation hiding treacherous depths. One wrong step off a barely visible game trail could send you plunging into cold, stagnant water, soaking your already damp clothing and filling your worn leather shoes with vile-smelling, clinging muck that would chafe your skin raw for days. Extracting yourself could be a desperate, exhausting struggle. The weather, too, was a character in this play, usually a villain. Gaul wasn't exactly the sunny Riviera. Expect rain. Lots of it. Not just refreshing showers, but cold, persistent, soul-drenching drizzle that soaked through even the thickest wool cloak eventually. Turned paths into treacherous mudslicks where every step was a gamble, and chilled you to the very marrow of your bones. Expect fog, thick, gray, and disorienting, that rolled in silently from rivers or marshes, swallowing landmarks, muffling sounds, and making navigation a terrifying guessing game based on instinct and increasingly frantic prayers. Expect wind, howling like hungry wolves through the high branches, tearing at your cloak, driving rain or sleet into your face, and carrying the unnerving sounds of the deep woods, or perhaps the sounds of approaching danger from unexpected directions. Even the sun, on the rare occasions it dominated the sky, could be an enemy, beating down mercilessly in open areas, reflecting blindingly off water surfaces, baking the earth until the air itself felt heavy, stagnant, and oppressive, leaving you dehydrated and gasping. The natural world wasn't a gentle mother goddess offering solace. It was a harsh, indifferent, often actively hostile force that constantly tested your resilience, your awareness, your route-finding skills, and your ability to find meager shelter where none seemed to exist. It wasn't just a landscape. It was an obstacle course designed by a committee of particularly malevolent nature spirits who really disliked uninvited guests. Imagine one particularly delightful day, starting in pre-dawn chill and fog so thick you can barely see your staff's end, navigating by feel and faint sounds. The fog lifts mid-morning only to be replaced by driving rain. You spend hours slogging through deepening mud, finally reaching a river swollen by the downpour, the usual ford now a raging torrent. You search for hours, soaked and freezing, finally finding a precarious, half-rotted log bridge. Halfway across, a sudden gust of wind nearly sends you plunging into the icy water. Reaching the other side, exhausted, you realize the track has been obliterated by a landslide. You spend the rest of the afternoon scrambling over treacherous, unstable mud and rock, only to find yourself in unfamiliar, dense forest as dusk falls, the rain still pouring, with no dry wood, no shelter, and the chilling howl of a wolf pack echoing nearby. Just another Tuesday on the pilgrimage trail. Now, let's refine the sensory assault, the bad kind. Imagine the ever-present soundtrack to your daily life, not just gentle birdsong, though there might be snatches, often drowned out or carrying specific, sometimes worrying information. The sharp alarm call of a jay, the territorial screech of a hawk. Far more constant was the squelch and suck of your own footsteps in mud, a sound that became maddeningly familiar. The rhythmic thump, slide, thump of your staff on the path, marking out the slow tempo of your progress. The whisper and rustle of leaves in the wind, sometimes soothing, often carrying sounds you strained to identify. Was that just the breeze sighing through the pines, or something large moving parallel to you just beyond the tree line? The incessant, inescapable drone of insects, particularly near water or during humid weather, mosquitoes whining near your ears, black flies delivering painful bites, midges forming swirling clouds around your head, crawling into your ears, eyes and nostrils with suicidal determination. Then, the punctuations, the distant howl of a wolf pack, perhaps answered by another, closer than comfortable. The sudden heart-stopping snap of a twig nearby, causing you to freeze, every sense straining. The deafening, unnerving chorus of frogs in a marsh at dusk. The occasional, terrifyingly loud grunt and crashing sound of a wild boar disturbed in the undergrowth. Something you really didn't want an argument with. And sometimes, perhaps most unnerving of all, the sudden, profound silence of a forest that seems to hold its breath, suggesting a large predator nearby. Or maybe, just maybe, the unnerving, disciplined quiet of a Roman patrol trying to move stealthily through terrain they found as alien and hostile as you sometimes did. Then, layer on the persistent physical discomforts, a constant low-level thrumming baseline of misery upon which the more acute pains played their variations. The inescapable feeling of damp wool clinging heavily to your skin, a clammy embrace that never truly left you, even on drier days. The chafing from rough spun fabric rubbing against damp skin, particularly in sensitive areas. The persistent dull ache in your shoulders and upper back from carrying even your meager possessions in a sack or bag, the straps digging in. The sharp sting of nettles brushed against accidentally. The crisscross network of scratches from thorns and branches, often becoming inflamed and itchy in the damp, dirty conditions. Sunburn on the rare clear days, adding tightness and stinging pain, followed by peeling skin. The jarring, cumulative pain in your knees and ankles from constantly navigating uneven terrain, stumbling on loose rocks or hidden roots that seemed placed with malicious intent. And overlaying it all, the pervasive feeling of being fundamentally grimy, caked in a sticky film of sweat, dirt, rain, and wood smoke, with no prospect of a proper, satisfying wash for days, or even weeks. It was a state of perpetual, low-grade physical assault, a constant reminder of your vulnerability. And the smells. Oh, the rich, complex, often profoundly unpleasant olfactory tapestry of ancient Gaul. Forget delicate floral notes or fragrant pine forests, unless you were lucky. Think first of the dominant chord. Damp earth, decaying leaves, wet vegetation, the smell of mold and humus, an odor that permeated everything, your clothes, your hair, your meager food supplies. Add the pungent, acrid aroma of wood smoke clinging stubbornly to your cloak and tunic from countless smoky, inefficient campfires. The sharp ammonia tang of animal droppings, fox, deer, boar, wolf, encountered frequently on the trail, sometimes distressingly fresh. Or the smell of domestic animals if you pass near a farmstead. Cattle, sheep, pigs, adding their own unique notes to the symphony. The stagnant, sulfurous, vaguely menacing stink rising from swamps and bogs, thick enough to taste. The smell of your own unwashed body and perpetually damp clothing, a constant, intimate companion you tried hard to ignore. The slightly metallic scent of recent rain on dry earth, or the heavier, cloying, ozone-tinged smell of an impending thunderstorm. Occasionally, the truly gag-inducing foul stench of a rotting animal carcass somewhere off the path, a stark reminder of mortality. And perhaps sometimes underlying it all, the faint, sharp, unsettling aroma of fear, your own cold sweat, or that carried on the wind from unseen dangers or conflicts. It was an ode to misery, a constant, inescapable reminder of the raw, untamed, unhygienic, and often unpleasant world you were forced to move through. This wasn't a walk in the park. It was a full-body immersion in the gritty, odorous, frequently hostile reality of survival on the edge. Now, every weary wanderer, especially one navigating the treacherous physical and metaphysical landscapes of ancient Gaul, needs their gear. The tools of the trade that supposedly make the journey possible, or at least marginally less likely to end prematurely in a ditch. For our Druid, this wasn't exactly an expedition kit outfitted by a wealthy patron. Think less as state-of-the-art expedition equipment, and more state of the ancestors, cobbled together necessities. Complete with all the inherent frustrations and reliability issues one might expect from items crafted by hand, subjected to relentless use, and constantly battling a hostile environment. His essential equipment wasn't designed for comfort, durability, or user-friendliness. It was grown, forged, stitched, or simply picked up out of sheer necessity, and often felt like it harbored a passive-aggressive resentment towards its owner. First and foremost, commanding pride of place, there was the staff. Not just any old stick, mind you. It was likely a carefully chosen length of sturdy, seasoned hardwood, perhaps ash, known for its strength and connection to the world tree. Oak, sacred and enduring, or maybe ritually significant hazel, associated with wisdom and divination. It might have been smoothed over years, even decades of handling, its surface polished to a dull sheen by the oils and sweat of its user's palm, feeling like an extension of his own arm. Or, if newer, it might still be rough, prone to shedding splinters at inconvenient moments. This wasn't merely a walking stick deployed for balance on uneven ground, though it certainly served that crucial purpose countless times a day. It was also a vital probe, cautiously testing the apparent solidity of moss-covered ground before committing his full weight. A habit that could mean the difference between crossing a bog safely and spending an hour trying to retrieve a suctioned boot from knee-deep slime. It served to push aside whipping branches and thorny vines that seemed to actively reach for his face. And occasionally, one might imagine, it was held defensively, more a symbol of, "Please don't eat me," than an actual weapon when encountering overly curious wolves or territorial wild boar. Perhaps it was even carved with subtle ogham markings or other symbols, imbuing it with protective or focusing properties, at least in the Druid's mind. But this trusty companion, this third leg, had its moments of sheer treachery. It could get wedged immovably between rocks with infuriating tenacity just when he needed to move quickly. Its fire-hardened tip could slip disastrously and unexpectedly on wet stones slick with algae while crossing a stream, sending him sprawling into the icy water with a curse that probably soured the local water spirits. And in the deep, penetrating cold of winter, the wood could feel brittle, alarmingly fragile, threatening to snap under sudden pressure, leaving him literally unsupported and potentially injured at the worst possible moment. It was less a faithful servant and more a stoic, occasionally malevolent partner in the ongoing crime of survival. Then there was the sickle. Not the large, heavy iron implement used by farmers for reaping harvests in broad swathes. No. This was a smaller, more delicate affair, perhaps still made of bronze long after iron became common for tools of war, or maybe fashioned from carefully worked iron by a skilled smith who understood its ritual purpose. Its curved blade, kept as sharp as conditions allowed, wasn't meant for hacking through brush, but for the precise, ritually significant harvesting of sacred plants. Mistletoe, the golden bough, had to be cut from the host oak, ideally during the 6th night of the moon, with such a blade, caught in a white cloth before it touched the earth. Specific herbs needed for healing potions, divinatory incense, or protective charms had to be gathered according to strict protocols. The correct lunar phase, the right time of day, dawn for some, dusk for others. Perhaps even facing a specific cardinal direction, all while murmuring the appropriate ancient chants under breath. This tool was essential for the Druid's actual job, the core of his ritual practice, the physical manifestation of his connection to the hidden virtues of the plant kingdom. But it wasn't exactly a versatile multi-tool. It was useless for heavy cutting or self-defense. Its small size made it infuriatingly easy to misplace amongst the leaf litter during a hasty camp setup in fading light, leading to frantic, panicked searching. The handle, perhaps fashioned from antler, bone, or polished yew wood, could loosen over time, the rivets or bindings working free. The precious blade could dull surprisingly quickly against unexpectedly tough plant stems or accidentally strike a hidden stone, requiring tedious and careful resharpening with a small, smooth whetstone, assuming he hadn't lost that vital accessory too, or that his hands weren't too numb with cold to hold it steady. and heaven forbid he dropped it while reaching precariously into the branches of a sacred tree during a solemn rite. Retrieving it might involve an undignified scramble up the trunk or a desperate search in the undergrowth that probably negated the ritual purity and cosmic harmony he was trying so hard to achieve. It was a specialized tool for a specialized trade, prone to being utterly useless for anything else, occasionally going missing at critical moments and demanding far more care than its simple appearance suggested. Let's not forget the ubiquitous bag or pouch slung over his shoulder or attached to his belt. Forget lightweight waterproof nylon. This was likely crafted from thick cured leather, perhaps deer or cattle hide, stiff and uncomfortable when new, eventually softening with use but also becoming prone to cracking, stretching, and developing holes along the seams, especially where the carrying strap rubbed. Or perhaps it was woven from heavy wool or flax fibers. Lighter maybe, but even more susceptible to snags from thorns, abrasion from rocks, and becoming utterly, depressingly saturated in the frequent Gallic rain, its contents developing a distinct aroma of mildew. Inside this fragile repository of hope and potential despair, his entire portable world. A small, precious stash of dried food. Smoked fish, dried berries, perhaps some parched grain, carefully rationed, always seeming less than it should be. Carefully wrapped bundles or small leather pouches containing dried herbs, the tools of his medicinal and ritual craft. Some for healing wounds, some for easing fevers, some for inducing visions, some for purification. Their specific properties and dosages hopefully remembered correctly under pressure. A fire-starting kit, the heart of survival. Maybe 2 carefully selected pieces of flint and a lump of iron pyrite or marcasite, which only produced weak sparks with vigorous, patient striking, a near impossibility with numb fingers and damp tinder. Or perhaps friction-based tools, a simple bow drill or hand drill, requiring immense effort, specific types of dry wood, and bone-dry tinder. Keeping the tinder, dried fungus like tinder fungus, charred linen scraps, teased out plant fibers. Absolutely, unequivocally dry was a constant, obsessive battle against the pervasive dampness, perhaps stored in a small, tightly sealed horn or wooden container. A small pot, maybe fire-hardened clay which could crack easily, or even traded for bronze if he was particularly well established or lucky, essential for boiling water, making it safer, cooking rudimentary meals, or brewing medicinal or ritual concoctions. Perhaps a few enigmatic personal items, polished river stones showing peculiar patterns, carved bone or antler charms inscribed with protective symbols, a small crystal, objects whose purpose was intensely meaningful to him, but which added weight without offering obvious practical benefits most of the time. This bag wasn't a reliable hold-all. It was a fragile, overloaded ecosystem of essentials threatened constantly by weather, wear and tear, and the simple, catastrophic misfortune of a strap breaking or a seam splitting at an inconvenient moment, spilling precious, irreplaceable contents into the mud or a rushing stream. Cursing it was common. Mending it, with clumsy stitches using a bone needle and sinew thread, was a frequent, necessary chore. And as for his state-of-the-art personal protective equipment, we've touched on it. But let's be clear. It consisted primarily of a tunic, likely heavy, scratchy wool dyed with some vegetable color, probably a faded brown or green, perhaps linen underneath in warmer weather if he could afford it. Over this, a cloak, the vital shield against the elements. Probably thick, felted wool, naturally somewhat water-repellent due to lanolin, at first, equipped with a deep hood. This was his shelter, his blanket, his primary defense. And it was about as effective against a prolonged Gallic downpour, or a biting winter wind as shielding yourself from charging cavalry with a strongly worded philosophical argument. Wool is warm, yes, even when damp, but it becomes incredibly heavy when fully soaked, clinging clammily and restricting movement. It offered minimal protection against persistent driving rain that eventually found its way through, or biting wind that whipped under the edges. Thorns ripped it with casual disdain. Branches snagged it constantly, requiring endless clumsy mending. It did little to deter the legions of biting insects who seemed to view it as an invitation to crawl underneath for warmth and sustenance. His footwear? Forget sturdy, Vibram-soled hiking boots. Think pieces of thick leather wrapped around the feet and lower legs and tied with thongs, or simple soft leather shoes sewn with sinew, perhaps stuffed with dry moss or grass for minimal insulation. They offered scant protection from sharp rocks or hidden roots, got soaked instantly when crossing streams or even walking through dewy grass, fostered fungal infections, and wore out with depressing regularity, requiring constant patching or replacement. Protection wasn't really the goal of his attire. Enduring exposure, with a thin layer of frequently damp wool between you and the hostile world, was simply part of the Druidic job description. Navigation. As mentioned, forget compasses, sextants, or neatly drawn maps annotated with "Here be dragons," or perhaps "Hic sunt Romani." His primary tools were his own highly trained, but ultimately fallible, senses, and his vast but not infallible memory. The position of the sun by day, when visible through the ever-present clouds. The complex patterns of the stars by night, again, weather permitting. The direction of the prevailing wind, interpreted by feel and its effect on trees. Familiar landmarks. A distinctively shaped hill that looked like a sleeping giant, an ancient standing stone carved with spiraling patterns, a particular bend in a well-known river, the smell of a pine forest versus an oak forest, knowledge passed down orally through generations about routes between sacred sites, often described in complex verses or stories, all incredibly impressive, demonstrating a deep, intimate connection with the natural world. Also, incredibly prone to spectacular failure. Fog could render even the most familiar landmarks invisible, reducing the world to a gray, featureless void. Continuous cloud cover could hide the sun and stars for days on end, leaving him reliant on subtle clues like moss growth on trees, not always reliable, or the direction of water flow. Unfamiliar territory presented a terrifying void of knowledge, forcing reliance on instinct, guesswork, and perhaps frantic internal prayers to whatever local spirit might be listening. Taking a wrong turn wasn't just inconvenient, delaying arrival. It could lead him into hostile tribal territory, impassable terrain like a vast bog or a steep ravine, or simply waste precious energy and dwindling supplies wandering aimlessly in circles. A deeply unnerving experience for someone supposed to be attuned to the rhythms of the world. His navigational tools were his own brain, eyes, and ears, constantly working, processing information, making deductions, but easily confused by fatigue, bad weather, or the simple, terrifying experience of being well and truly lost. Knowledge itself was a tool, perhaps his most important one. But memory could falter, interpretations could be wrong, and the world didn't always conform to the patterns he'd learned. And yet, despite this daily catalog of failures, potential failures, infuriating limitations, and general inadequacy, these humble, often frustrating tools were his lifeline. The staff that tripped him also saved him from countless falls on treacherous ground. The fiddly little sickle that was easily lost was also the key to unlocking the potent magic of the plant kingdom, the symbol of his unique purpose. The leaky bag that threatened to betray him at any moment was also what carried the means of survival. The fire kit, the food, the medicine. The heavy, damp cloak that offered such poor protection was still better than nothing. A minimal shield against the biting wind and rain, a meager blanket against the chilling night. He cursed them frequently, under his breath, or perhaps aloud to the unlistening trees, when they failed him. He worried about them constantly, protecting them as best he could from the elements, tucking the fire kit deep within his driest wrappings, carefully cleaning and drying the sickle after use. He mended the bag with painstaking, clumsy stitches, resharpened the sickle on a worn whetstone found by a stream, perhaps treated the staff with rendered animal fat, to try and preserve the wood. It was an unholy matrimony, a bond forged in shared misery, constant use, and grudging mutual dependency. These weren't convenient aids that made life easy. They were the absolute bare minimum required to engage with a world that seemed actively determined to wear them, and him, down. Their failures, their flaws, their inherent limitations were just another layer of the pervasive, grinding suck that defined his wandering existence. This kind of life, this relentless grind of movement through hostile environments, exposure to brutal weather, questionable sustenance, constant low-level anxiety, and the sheer physical strain of it all, doesn't exactly lead to a graceful aging process or a comfortable extended lifespan. It extracts a heavy, unavoidable price, paid in daily installments by the suffering body and the beleaguered mind. By the time he reached what a pampered Roman nobleman, lounging in his heated villa, might consider his early prime, say his late 30s or early 40s, our wandering druid's body was likely already becoming a walking, groaning museum of occupational hazards. It was a living chronicle of the cumulative effects of damp, strain, injury, inadequate nutrition, and sheer unrelenting mileage. His spine, after decades spent traversing uneven terrain, often hunched against driving rain, or peering intently at the ground searching for tracks, omens, or edible weeds, probably felt less like a supportive column, and more like a gnarled oak branch stressed to its breaking point. Sharp, sudden jolts of agony radiating down his legs from a protesting nerve were likely common companions, turning a simple step into a moment of blinding pain. His joints, particularly the weight-bearing ones like knees, hips, and ankles, would almost certainly sing discordant arias of agony, especially on cold, damp mornings when they felt like they were grinding bone against bone. Arthritis wasn't some distant ailment of venerable old age. It was a constant, grinding midlife companion, eroding cartilage with every footfall, making movement a conscious, often intensely painful effort. Forget nimble leaps across streams. Just standing up after resting could be a slow, creaking, multi-stage process accompanied by involuntary groans. His feet, those poor, abused servants carrying him across the rough face of Gaul, constantly damp, prone to blisters that easily became infected, rubbed raw by coarse wrappings, plagued by fungal infections blooming like evil little gardens in the perpetually moist environment inside his worn leather shoes, perhaps plagued by fallen arches, heel spurs, or joints simply worn down by the relentless impact. They were less reliable modes of transport, and more twin sources of simmering resentment, directed at the very ground he walked upon, throbbing painfully at the end of each day. His hands, oh, his magnificent ruined hands, the instruments of his ritual craft. After years of gripping a staff in all weathers, gathering rough or thorny herbs, performing intricate ritual gestures with numb fingers, tending smoky fires, and attempting basic tool maintenance, they wouldn't be the smooth, pale hands of a sheltered scholar. Think less flesh and blood, more gnarled root systems dug from resistant earth. The palms thick with calluses that sometimes cracked painfully, the knuckles likely swollen and stiffening with arthritis, the skin weathered like old leather, crisscrossed with small scars from thorns, cuts, and burns. Fine motor skills, essential for certain delicate ritual actions like knotting intricate patterns or inscribing small symbols, might become increasingly challenging, a source of both physical difficulty and deep professional anxiety. Was he losing his touch, his connection, his skin elsewhere, constantly exposed to wind, sun, on rare occasions, rain, biting insects, and campfire smoke, would be prematurely aged, tough and leathery on his face and neck, perhaps prone to persistent, itchy rashes or unpleasant fungal afflictions in areas like the groin or armpits that never seemed to truly dry out. Add to that the constant companionship of lice in his hair and cloak, or ticks picked up walking through tall grass. Potential carriers of fever. More itching, more discomfort, more vectors for disease. his eyes forever scanning the horizon for landmarks or danger, peering into gloomy forests for game trails or ritual sites, studying the subtle patterns of the night sky, reading omens in the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals. A messy, stomach-churning business would inevitably be strained, perhaps prone to infections from rubbing away dust or insects with grimy hands. His vision, so crucial for navigation and interpreting the world's subtle messages, might begin to blur at the edges, the constellations seeming just a bit fuzzier, distant figures harder to resolve, forcing him to rely more on his other, perhaps also declining senses. Did his hearing suffer too, after years of exposure to howling winds and the crackling roar of fires? Subtle sounds, warnings, might be missed. And dental health? Let's be generous and call it a disaster waiting to happen. A diet often coarse and gritty, combined with rudimentary or entirely non-existent hygiene. A quick rinse with stream water doesn't count, meant teeth were likely worn down, chipped from biting on unexpected grit or bone, perhaps loosened by gum disease, or simply lost altogether to abscesses that flared into blinding, debilitating agony, treatable only with stoicism, or, perhaps, a desperate self-administered extraction using makeshift tools. A truly horrifying prospect. Forget a gleaming smile. Think a cautious, tight-lipped expression, hiding a landscape of dental devastation. He wouldn't just look older than his years. He'd feel ancient, his body a creaking, complaining, unreliable vessel carrying him reluctantly towards the next sacred grove, the next uncertain encounter. Minor injuries, easily treatable today, were serious threats. A deep cut from a slip of his knife while skinning a rabbit could become dangerously infected in the absence of proper cleaning and antiseptics, leading to fever, swelling, and potential death. A fall resulting in a sprained ankle, or even a simple fracture, could be catastrophic for a wanderer, rendering him immobile, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on the uncertain charity of strangers or the elements. Self-treatment involved rudimentary herbal poultices, hoping he remembered the right ones. Binding wounds with strips of cloth, often dirty, and simply enduring the pain and hoping for the best. A gamble against infection and long-term disability. But it wasn't just the spectacular injuries from falls, the slow grind of skeletal decay, or the external attacks from parasites that wore him down. Oh no, the Gallic environment, particularly its wetter regions and less than pristine water sources, was also a prolific distributor of fascinating internal afflictions, microscopic enemies that launched devastating assaults from within. Water, scooped hastily from streams potentially contaminated by animal waste upstream, or collected from stagnant pools buzzing with insects, could be teeming with invisible life eager to establish a new colony in his unprepared intestines. Dysentery. That truly delightful affliction bringing violent cramping, uncontrollable watery stools tinged with blood, fever, crippling weakness, and rapid dehydration, was likely a frequent and profoundly unwelcome travel companion. An attack could leave him utterly incapacitated for days, unable to travel, barely able to sip water, vulnerable and miserable, praying for it to pass before he wasted away completely. Marshy areas, common across Gaul, were breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And while we often associate malaria primarily with warmer climates, fevers transmitted by insects, the intermittent, unpredictable ague, were certainly known and feared in ancient Europe. These brought debilitating cycles of intense chills that shook the entire body, followed by burning fever that left him delirious, and then drenching sweats that soaked his clothes and left him utterly exhausted and weak, recurring unpredictably for weeks or months. Constant exposure to damp, cold air, coupled with the frequent inhalation of acrid wood smoke from countless campfires huddled over in poorly ventilated shelters or just out in the open, would inevitably take its toll on his lungs. A persistent, rasping cough, deepening into bronchitis with accompanying chest pain and phlegm, was a common misery, particularly during the miserable, long winter months. Pneumonia, a deadly inflammation of the lungs, was a constant threat, easily capable of finishing off someone already weakened by malnutrition and exposure. And let's not forget the insidious, cumulative effects of chronic, low-level malnutrition and dehydration. Even if not actively starving, the diet was often monotonous, lacking in essential vitamins and minerals found in fresh greens, especially out of season, fresh meat, or reliable sources of fat. This didn't just mean gnawing hunger pangs and occasional dizziness. It meant a chronically weakened immune system, making him far more susceptible to every passing ailment, from common coughs to dangerous fevers. It meant wounds healed slowly and poorly, easily becoming infected. It might lead to specific deficiency issues like night blindness, lack of vitamin A, or painful skin conditions. Above all, it contributed to a level of profound bone-deep exhaustion that even a rare full night's sleep, itself a fantasy, could barely begin to dent. His body wasn't just aging naturally, it was being systematically broken down, eroded from the outside in and the inside out by the relentless demands and hostile conditions of his existence. While his physical body was engaged in this constant losing battle against physics, biology, and the sheer indifference of the universe, his mind was simultaneously fighting its own silent, exhausting war, navigating a treacherous internal landscape of fear, monotony, isolation, and immense pressure. There was the ever-present, low-grade hum of fear, a baseline static beneath the surface of his thoughts. Fear of Roman patrols, the distinctive clank of hobnailed sandals, the glimpse of segmented armor, or a standardized eagle through the trees could trigger immediate, heart-pounding terror. Legions weren't known for their gentle handling of Druids, who were officially proscribed by Rome, often seen as political instigators and practitioners of barbaric rites involving human sacrifice. Whether true or just propaganda, the Romans believed it. Capture could mean brutal interrogation, torture to extract information about tribal resistance, public execution as an example, or consignment to the slow death of the mines or quarries. Fear, too, of stumbling into a violent dispute between Gallic tribes. His status as a Druid might offer no protection, or worse, mark him as a potential advisor or spy for the enemy. Getting caught in the crossfire of a raid or battle was a distinct possibility. Fear of the natural world itself, the sudden, terrifying charge of a wounded boar, the silent approach of a wolf pack in the twilight, the disorienting terror of getting truly lost in impenetrable fog or a blinding blizzard, the possibility of succumbing to exposure or illness, far from any potential help. This wasn't usually paralyzing terror, but a constant background radiation of anxiety, sharpening the senses perhaps, but also slowly, inexorably, eroding the spirit, leaching the color from the world. Then there was the sheer soul-crushing monotony, a heavy gray blanket smothering the spirit. Yes, there were moments of ritual intensity, significant festivals, consultations with important chieftains, perhaps even the thrill of discovering a new sacred site. But surrounding these peaks of significance were vast stretches of walking. Days, weeks, sometimes months of putting one foot in front of the other, through landscapes that, while perhaps possessing a certain wild beauty, could become oppressively familiar in their hostility. The same damp forest, filtering the same gray light, the same muddy tracks sucking at his feet, the same struggle for basic survival, the same limited conversation, if any. This relentless sameness, the lack of novelty or stimulating intellectual company for long periods, could weigh heavily on a mind trained in complex thought and filled with intricate knowledge. It was a stark, grinding contrast to the rich inner world of cosmology, law, and legend he carried within him. Add to this the profound potential for isolation. Even if respected or occasionally sought out for his wisdom, a Druid was often fundamentally set apart. His knowledge, his practices, his perceived connection to the other world could inspire awe, certainly, but also fear, mistrust, and misunderstanding among common folk. Hospitality might be offered out of duty or superstition, but true companionship, someone to share the unburdened thoughts and anxieties of the road with, someone who truly understood, might be exceptionally rare, perhaps only found fleetingly with another Druid, who might also be a rival. He carried the immense weight of his traditions, the vast library of memorized laws, genealogies, cosmological understanding, and ritual procedures, largely alone. The responsibility was immense. A single misremembered verse, a wrongly interpreted omen could have significant consequences for individuals or the community. And if traveling during the turbulent times of Roman conquest or consolidation, he might also bear the silent grief of witnessing the desecration of sacred groves cleared for farmland or military roads, the felling of ancient, venerated trees for timber, the erosion of the very culture and language he was sworn to uphold. A deeply painful, isolating experience, adding a layer of helpless grief, and perhaps impotent, burning anger to the daily grind. Imagine him standing hidden, watching Roman soldiers carelessly toss sacred carved stones onto a bonfire, the smoke mingling with his own quiet despair. His inner world likely became a fortress built of stoic resignation, its walls occasionally breached by flashes of that impotent anger, or perhaps defended by a bleak, weary cynicism that sat uneasily side his spiritual duties. How did he cope? How did he not simply curl up under a log and give up? Perhaps through meticulous, almost obsessive adherence to ritual, finding structure, meaning, and a sense of control in the precise performance of ancient rites, even when performed alone in the heart of the wilderness. The familiar words and gestures a bulwark against the surrounding chaos. Perhaps through deep meditation, seeking connection to the spirits of place, the enduring land itself, as a refuge from the harshness of the physical world and the anxieties of the human one. Maybe through the disciplined practice of chanting, the resonant sounds focusing the mind, pushing away the intrusive thoughts of fear and exhaustion. He might have found solace in observing the intricate beauty of small things often overlooked, the perfect spiral of a snail shell, the tenacity of a fern growing from a rock crevice, the complex patterns of frost on a winter morning, brief moments of connection to the enduring non-human world. Or perhaps he developed a form of grim, internal humor, a deeply sarcastic running commentary on the absurdity of trying to maintain cosmic balance while simultaneously trying to dislodge a particularly determined leech from one's nether regions. Or maybe ultimately it was simply through sheer, stubborn, unyielding endurance, a refusal to break, driven by a profound, deeply ingrained sense of duty to the knowledge he carried, the traditions he embodied, and the people and land he served. However thankless and painful the task often felt, the mental strain was invisible, unrecorded, leaving no archaeological trace. But it was as real, as debilitating, and as potentially fatal as any physical ailment or external threat. It was the silent grinding of the soul against the harsh realities of a weary wanderer's life. You might think, given the constant struggle against the indifferent cruelty of nature and the limitations of his own aging body, that encountering fellow human beings would offer a welcome respite, a moment of connection in a harsh world. You would, frequently, be spectacularly, depressingly wrong. People, in their infinite capacity for suspicion, arrogance, ignorance, and ingratitude, often proved to be just another layer of complication, another source of friction, another reason for our wandering Druid to contemplate the philosophical merits of becoming a hermit in a particularly inaccessible cave. Travel, especially purposeful travel like a pilgrimage or circuit, rarely happens in a vacuum, and the human element, from powerful chieftains to wary peasants to ambitious colleagues, could be as thorny, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous as any hidden patch of stinging nettles. Let's consider the clients, for want of a more dignified term. The chieftains, tribal leaders, and village elders who occasionally sought out, or perhaps imperiously summoned, the Druid's specialized services. Picture the scene. You're finally ushered into the smoky, dimly lit great hall of some local potentate, Let's call him Divisiacus the Demanding, a cousin perhaps of the more famous one. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, roasting meat, none of which you've been offered yet, and damp dogs sleeping by the central hearth. Nervous retainers eye you sideways, while Divisiacus himself, perched on a slightly more elaborate than everyone else's stool, regards you with an expression blending impatience and ingrained skepticism. He wants an omen. Now, should he launch the raid against the neighboring tribe who insulted his prize bull, or perhaps wait until after the harvest moon? The fate of his warriors, the honor of his clan, hangs in the balance. Or at least, that's how he frames it. So, you begin the process. Perhaps calling for silence, composing yourself, despite the gnawing hunger and the damp chill still clinging to your bones. Maybe you examine the flight patterns of birds startled from the thatch roof, trying to interpret their calls, their numbers, the direction they fly against the backdrop of the scudding clouds. Or, more gruesomely, you might oversee the sacrifice of a cockerel or pig, peering intently into the still steaming entrails, looking for irregularities, specific colors or shapes that correspond to the vast, memorized catalog of omens, all the while feeling the weight of the chieftain's impatient gaze, the barely concealed fear or hope in the eyes of his assembled council. Finally, you deliver your carefully considered, probably deliberately ambiguous, pronouncement. The signs are complex, O chieftain. Caution is warranted, yet boldness at the right moment might be rewarded, perhaps delaying until the sickle moon wanes, unless Jupiter's star burns brightly, leaving enough wiggle room for interpretation and, hopefully, for your own survival. If the raid, whenever he decides to launch it, is successful, well, clearly, Diviciacus's strategic genius and the unparalleled bravery of his warriors carried the day. Your vague pronouncements are conveniently forgotten, or perhaps briefly lauded as confirmation of his own brilliance. Competence, after all, was merely expected. But if the raid fails spectacularly, if the enemy was waiting in ambush, or if disease sweeps through the warrior's camp, suddenly, it's your interpretation that was flawed, your connection to the spirits that clearly malfunctioned, your fault entirely. The chieftain's glare could freeze spit in midair, and the promised reward, perhaps safe lodging for a week, a decent meal, maybe even that slightly less threadbare replacement cloak you desperately needed, might suddenly evaporate, replaced by pointed suggestions that your presence is now considered unlucky and you should continue your vital pilgrimage elsewhere, preferably before sunrise. The pressure was immense, the stakes potentially lethal, and the appreciation fleeting at best. Then there were the village elders, perhaps summoning you with less pomp but equal expectation, to bless the fields before planting, perform a complex healing ritual for someone afflicted by a lingering cough or a mysterious wasting sickness, or preside over the naming ceremony for a newborn heir. You'd go through the prescribed motions, the ancient chants learned over decades, the careful preparation and application of specific herbs gathered with no small effort and risk from remote locations. You'd project an aura of calm authority and profound knowledge, even if inwardly you were just hoping the placebo effect was strong with this particular group. If the harvest proved bountiful, or the patient rallied, or the child grew strong, relief all around certainly, perhaps a genuine smile or a nod of thanks, but rarely effusive gratitude or significant reward. Again, this was simply your job, fulfilling the function society expected of you. But if the blight shriveled the crops anyway, or the patient succumbed to their illness despite your best efforts, or the child remained sickly, whispers would inevitably start. Was the Druid losing his touch? Had he perhaps angered some local spirit with an imperfectly performed ritual? Was he even a real Druid, or just some wandering charlatan? Suspicion could curdle faster than milk left out in the sun. You weren't just a spiritual guide or healer. You were often a convenient lightning rod for communal anxieties, a scapegoat when the capricious forces of nature, disease, or simple bad luck failed to cooperate with human desires. And did anyone ever truly appreciate the sheer effort involved? The decades of grueling memorization, the nuanced understanding of natural cycles and celestial mechanics, the physical hardship endured to simply reach their remote village, the mental fortitude required to maintain focus and authority under constant scrutiny and pressure. Did anyone ever clap you on the back and say, "Remarkable job, old chap," accurately predicting that solar eclipse and remembering that incredibly obscure legal precedent regarding stolen pigs from 3 generations ago? Have an extra helping of stew? Highly unlikely. Gratitude, if expressed at all, was often a grudging acknowledgement, a temporary currency seldom traded generously. Your reward, typically, was simply being allowed to continue your miserable existence, perhaps with a slightly less empty belly for a night or two before moving on. You weren't viewed as a highly skilled practitioner of ancient and complex traditions requiring immense dedication. You were often perceived as a necessary but ultimately expendable spiritual functionary. A cosmic repairman, called in when the metaphysical plumbing was blocked, expected to fix it quickly and efficiently, and then promptly disappear until the next inevitable crisis, hopefully without tracking too much potentially unlucky mud onto the chieftain's nice dirt floor. Failure, or even perceived failure, was punished, or at least noted with lasting disapproval. Success was merely the expected baseline, quickly forgotten once the immediate need passed. And the common folk you encountered on the road, or milling about in villages, a thoroughly mixed bag, heavily weighted towards potentially problematic or utterly indifferent. While some tribes or remote communities might hold Druids in genuine reverence, perhaps due to long tradition or the influence of a respected local elder, offering shelter and simple food without question, this was far from universal. In other areas, perhaps closer to Roman influence where anti-Druid propaganda flowed freely, or among tribes with rival priestly factions, or simply among people naturally suspicious of any outsider, the reaction could range from wary avoidance to open hostility. Imagine arriving at a small, isolated village, huddled behind its dilapidated wooden palisade as dusk falls, rain starting to lash down, exhausted and hungry, only to be met with barred gates and suspicious eyes peering through the cracks. Your calm explanations about your peaceful pilgrimage, your sacred duties, fall on deaf ears. Maybe they mutter about strangers bringing bad luck, or perhaps they fear attracting Roman attention. Whatever the reason, no amount of reasoned argument or appeal to tradition will get you admitted. You are simply told, perhaps not unkindly, perhaps with harsh threats, to move on, leaving you to face the deepening night, the worsening weather, and whatever predators, animal or human, lurked in the sodden woods, utterly alone. These encounters weren't just inconvenient rejections. They were potentially lethal, reinforcing a bitter sense of isolation and vulnerability. You were a man supposedly holding the keys to cosmic understanding, yet sometimes unable to secure basic shelter from the very people you might, in theory, be trying to serve. The ambiguity of your status, revered by some, feared by others, ignored by many, was a constant source of tension. People might lower their eyes respectfully, but also hurry their children indoors. They might offer you food, but watch your every move with suspicion. Then there were your supposed colleagues, your fellow sufferers navigating the same esoteric paths within the broader Druidic order. The wandering life could be profoundly lonely, and encountering another Druid on the trail might occasionally offer a rare spark of genuine connection. A chance to exchange news from different regions, which tribes were restless, where the Romans were active, news of mutual acquaintances, an opportunity to discuss interpretations of recent omens, debate points of law or cosmology, or simply share the relief of speaking with someone who truly understood the unique burdens, frustrations, and perhaps even the subtle satisfactions of the profession. A grim sort of camaraderie could flicker to life over a shared smoky fire in some makeshift shelter, trading stories, perhaps slightly embellished, of particularly obtuse chieftains, near misses with Roman patrols, or the successful application of some obscure herbal remedy. Laughter, when it occurred between colleagues, was likely a harsh, barking sound, a shared acknowledgement of the pervasive absurdity and misery of their existence rather than an expression of genuine joy. But let's not romanticize these encounters either. The Druidic world, despite Roman portrayals of a unified, centrally controlled organization, wasn't necessarily one big, happy, robe-wearing family, chanting in perfect harmony. There were almost certainly hierarchies, different schools of thought, fierce regional traditions, and undoubtedly sharp professional rivalries simmering beneath the surface of collegial respect. An older, established druid, perhaps head of a renowned teaching center, might view a younger, less experienced wanderer with condescension, suspicion, or as unwelcome competition for influence, students, or the patronage of powerful chieftains. Debates over interpretations of law, ritual procedures, or fine points of cosmology could become intensely heated, less about philosophical discovery and more about establishing intellectual dominance or defending regional prestige. Information, particularly valuable or secret lore, might be jealously hoarded, not generously shared. An encounter with another druid could therefore be less a joyful meeting of minds and more a wary, cautious circling, each subtly probing the other's knowledge, affiliations, and potential threat level. And if you were traveling with an apprentice, that added another layer of complexity, the constant responsibility for their safety and training, the tediousness of repeating basic instruction, perhaps dealing with youthful arrogance, incompetence, or simple homesickness, all while trying to manage your own survival and professional obligations. Your companions in this esoteric struggle were sometimes allies, sometimes wary rivals, sometimes just another exhausting complication on an already overcrowded itinerary of suffering. The human element, far from offering consistent solace or support, often just added another unpredictable, potentially dangerous variable to an already chaotic and draining existence. Trust was a rare commodity, earned slowly and lost easily. After successfully navigating, or perhaps merely surviving, the complex, often treacherous currents of human interaction, surely our wandering druid could look forward to indulging in some basic creature comforts at the end of a long day's trudge. A decent, filling meal to warm his belly, a dry, secure place to sleep off the crushing fatigue, a solid, uninterrupted night's rest to face the morrow. Let's gently, but firmly, disabuse ourselves of these modern comforting notions. The luxuries available to an itinerant spiritual advisor in ancient Gaul were, shall we say, calibrated to a significantly different, far grimmer scale of expectation. Think less luxury resort and more lightly mitigated squalor with bonus insects. Forget 5-star ratings. He was operating on a system where not actively life-threatening counted as a win. First, let's talk about dining. The often desperate culinary tour of despair that constituted his daily sustenance. Forget visions of groaning boards piled high with roasted meats and overflowing flagons. Unless he stumbled into an exceptionally rare high-status feast, celebrating a major victory or political alliance. And even then, his place might be far down the smoky table. More often, food was purely functional. Fuel acquired through a precarious combination of hope, opportunism, diligent searching, and sheer grinding necessity. When hospitality was offered, it might consist of a grudging share of whatever the household, often poor peasants themselves, was eating. Perhaps a thin, smoky stew, bulked out with barley or oats, flavored with maybe a few foraged greens like nettles or sorrel, and if the gods were truly smiling upon him that day, containing a few gristly scraps of boiled mutton, or the occasional small bony fish pulled from a nearby stream. A good meal might involve slightly thicker stew, maybe with a chunk of dark, heavy bread that wasn't actively crawling with weevils, or a lump of strong, pungent cheese. A bad meal could be little more than watery porridge, barely warm, served with a side of silent resentment from hosts who clearly had little to spare. Accepting such meager offerings could be socially awkward, knowing you were consuming resources desperately needed by the family, adding another layer of discomfort to the meal. The staple, however, when relying on hosts or his own meager supplies, was often bread, and not the light, airy loaves we know. Think dense, coarse, often gritty flatbreads or cakes made from roughly ground barley, oats, or perhaps spelt, cooked quickly on a hot stone by the fire or directly in the embers. Filling, yes, in a leaden sort of way, but often tasting progressively more like compacted sawdust or baked earth as the days wore on from when it was made, sometimes accompanied by a raw onion or leek for flavor, if available. Exciting variations included, well, mostly just different levels of staleness or the occasional bonus crunch of sand or stone dust from the grinding process. Forget balanced nutrition. This was about staving off collapse. When hospitality wasn't forthcoming, which was a frequent occurrence, especially when traveling between settlements or through less friendly territories, he relied entirely on his own foraging skills and whatever pitiful supplies he carried. This meant hours spent scanning the undergrowth, identifying edible plants amidst a sea of potentially poisonous lookalikes. Maybe finding some wild garlic to spice up the blandness, young nettle leaves, carefully handled, to boil into a vaguely nutritious mush, sorrel for a sharp tang, or perhaps, in season, a handful of wild berries like bilberries or raspberries, always competing with the birds and other animals for these scarce resources. Nuts like hazelnuts or acorns, gathered and hoarded in autumn, could provide vital fats and protein, but were heavy to carry and required processing. Leaching bitterness from acorns was a time-consuming chore. Edible roots had to be dug from the often resistant ground, requiring effort and careful identification. Mistaking hemlock root for wild parsnip was a fatal, final mistake. Hunting? While he might know how to set simple snares for rabbits or birds, success was far from guaranteed, required time and luck he often didn't have, and risked attracting unwanted attention. More often, foraging yielded slim pickings, a constant low-level hunger gnawing at his belly, a reminder of his precarious reliance on the whims of nature and human generosity. Forget choosing what to eat. It was about finding anything remotely edible, especially in winter, when the landscape offered little beyond bare branches and frozen ground. Survival depended heavily on stored supplies, or finding communities willing and able to share their own dwindling stocks. And water. The essential fuel for life, scooped directly from streams, rivers, or collected rainwater pools, the generous, if bacterially adventurous, local sources. Clarity was no guarantee of purity. Checking for animal carcasses or latrine runoff upstream from settlements was advisable but not always possible or effective. The water often had a distinct taste, metallic, earthy, stagnant, and carried the invisible risk of dysentery or other delightful waterborne diseases that could lay him low for days. Finding a clear, cold spring bubbling directly from the rock was a rare blessing, worth remembering and returning to if possible. Sometimes, weak, sour ale or mead might be offered by hosts, arguably safer than suspect water due to the fermentation process, but offering its own set of challenges like dehydration or impaired judgment if consumed in quantity on an empty stomach. Feasting was a rare, almost mythical event. Subsistence was the harsh, daily reality. It wasn't about culinary enjoyment. It was about ingesting enough calories and fluids to keep walking, thinking, and performing the necessary rituals without collapsing into a heap. Hygiene associated with food preparation. Let's just say, washing hands thoroughly wasn't always feasible or considered a priority when your main goal was finding anything to put in your mouth before you fainted from hunger. And where did our wise, nature-attuned Druid lay his head at night to rest his weary bones? His sleeping quarters, far more often than not, were simply wherever he happened to drop from exhaustion when darkness fell, ideally somewhere marginally less exposed or threatening than the middle of an open field under a stormy sky. This often meant seeking the meager shelter offered beneath a rocky overhang, frequently damp, dripping, and already occupied by bats or spiders. Or perhaps finding refuge within a dense thicket of bushes or young trees, which offered some minimal protection from the wind but also provided excellent accommodation for swarms of insects, and ensured he woke up covered in dew or frost. Sometimes he might find a hollow at the base of a large ancient tree, curling up amongst the roots, hoping its spirit didn't mind the intrusion or his probable snoring. A hastily constructed lean-to, fashioned from fallen branches, leaned against a trunk and perhaps layered with bracken or leafy twigs, might offer a psychological barrier against the encroaching darkness and some slight deflection of rain, but did little to stop the wind from whistling through the gaps or the inevitable leaks from dripping onto his face just as he was drifting off. His bed? 9 times out of 10, the cold, hard, often damp and lumpy earth. Maybe, if time and energy permitted, a pile of bracken, dead leaves, or dry grass scraped together for minimal insulation and cushioning, which also provided a warm and welcoming habitat for slugs, beetles, woodlice, and other small crawling things that might explore his sleeping form during the night. His pillow? Usually a smooth, or not so smooth rock, a gnarled tree root conveniently placed to dig into his neck, or maybe his own bundled up damp cloak if he wasn't already wearing it, desperately trying to conserve body heat. Privacy? An utterly alien concept, as foreign as germ theory or representative democracy. When offered shelter in a village roundhouse, a rare luxury, it usually meant finding a small patch of the packed earth floor amidst the sprawling family, their various retainers, assorted dogs seeking warmth, chickens that might wander in and out, and the thick, eye-watering, permanently choking smoke from the central hearth that never quite found its way out through the inadequate hole in the roof. Personal space was non-existent. Lice and fleas weren't just a risk. They were practically guaranteed bonus features of communal living, unwelcome bedfellows. Forget thread counts and hypoallergenic fillings. Think dirt clumps, shared body heat, not always unwelcome in winter. The smell of unwashed companions, and the constant background noise of snoring, coughing, babies crying, and animals scratching. It wasn't restful sleep. It was strategic cessation of movement in marginally less hostile conditions than open wilderness, often leaving him feeling more tired upon waking. But surely, once settled into his luxurious patch of damp earth, smoky floor, or insect-infested root hollow, he could at least count on getting some uninterrupted sleep to recover from the day's exertions. Oh, you sweet, tragically optimistic soul. The very notion that the night was intended for 8 hours of blissful, restorative, unbroken slumber was a charming fairy tale, likely told by people who lived in sturdy houses with locked doors and didn't have to worry about wolves or Roman patrols. If you weren't jolted awake by the agonizing throb of your protesting muscles reaching a critical point, or the gnawing emptiness in your stomach demanding attention, or the chilling dampness finally seeping through your last layer of wool to touch your skin, there were plenty of other diversions ready to shatter the fragile peace of the night. If you were fortunate and skilled enough to have managed to start and maintain a fire, a precious commodity requiring dry wood scavenged earlier, and successful ignition against the odds, someone had to tend it through the long, dark hours, feeding it small branches periodically to keep it from dying out, both for warmth and as a minimal deterrent against predators, animal, and perhaps human, was crucial. That someone, especially if traveling alone, or with only a young apprentice, was often you, requiring you to wake repeatedly. Then there was the constant need for vigilance, even in sleep. Your subconscious remained on high alert. Was that rustling sound just the wind stirring the leaves, or something large and hungry investigating the scent of your camp? Was that distant shout just drunken revelry from a village miles away, or a sign of conflict or pursuit you needed to be aware of? Was that snapping twig an innocent nocturnal animal? Or someone trying to approach stealthily? Standing watch, even informally while dozing lightly, meant true. Deep sleep was a rare luxury. Every unfamiliar sound could trigger a jolt of adrenaline, jerking you awake, heart pounding. Even without external threats or duties, simple physical discomfort often conspired to make deep, restorative sleep impossible. The unrelenting hardness of the ground, pressing against already sore joints and muscles. The penetrating cold, especially in the hours before dawn, that no amount of huddling seemed to fully ward off. The pervasive dampness that made clothes feel clammy and chilling. The incessant whining and biting of mosquitoes finding their way under your cloak, or the maddening itching from previous bites or flea infestations. The need to shift position constantly to try and find a less painful angle for an aching hip or back. Add to this the mental state, the anxieties replaying in the quiet darkness. Worry about the next day's journey, the dwindling food supplies, the upcoming potentially hostile encounter with suspicious villagers or Roman soldiers, the weight of correctly remembering and performing complex rituals, the fear of failure, the burden of leadership if guiding others. The mind, instead of resting, might race with worries, endlessly rehearse memorized lore, or simply refuse to shut down. True rest became a rare and precious commodity, snatched in brief, unsatisfying, easily broken chunks between bouts of discomfort and anxiety. Chronic sleep deprivation wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was a fundamental, debilitating state of being for the wandering Druid, contributing significantly to the physical exhaustion, impairing judgment, shortening tempers, dulling the senses, weakening the immune system, and generally making the already profound suckiness of his existence even harder to bear. The luxuries of food, shelter, and rest were often just different facets of the same rough, uncomfortable, exhausting reality. So, our wandering Druid endures appalling conditions, questionable and insufficient food, virtually non-existent shelter, chronic sleep deprivation, constant physical and mental strain, and navigates the often treacherous currents of human interaction, all while performing functions supposedly vital to the spiritual and social health of Gallic society. Judge, priest, historian, advisor, healer, repository of sacred ancestral knowledge. Surely, for undertaking such a demanding, multifaceted, and theoretically crucial role, he must have been handsomely compensated. Maybe not rolling in Roman denarii, but perhaps comfortably well off by local standards? Possessing a well-stocked purse of Celtic silver rings? Or perhaps guaranteed the best cuts of meat and the warmest corner by the hearth wherever he went? Let's gently, but firmly, shatter that comforting illusion against the harsh rocks of historical reality. The concept of a regular payday, a standardized salary, or even a reliable fee-for-service structure involving neatly stacked currency or guaranteed provisions was, for most wandering Druids operating outside major tribal centers or established sanctuaries, a delightful fiction. It was about as realistic as expecting a Roman tax collector to offer a generous refund, or a wolf pack to politely inquire before stealing your drying fish. His wages, such as they were, arrived not in predictable installments, but erratically, unpredictably, and primarily in kind, with the consistency of spring weather in Gaul, occasionally bright and generous, often gray and grudging, sometimes just a frustratingly empty drizzle. The primary, most fundamental form of compensation was simple hospitality, the granting of basic survival necessities. This could range wildly. On a good day, after perhaps successfully performing a much-needed healing ritual or delivering an omen that pleased a powerful chieftain, he might receive genuinely warm welcome. An invitation into the smoky but relatively secure roundhouse, a place near the fire, a generous portion of the family meal, maybe even featuring actual roasted meat, and perhaps a bed of dry bracken or straw, set slightly apart from the main sleeping huddle. Such moments were rare treasures, savored not just for the physical comfort, but for the brief, reassuring sense of belonging and acknowledged value. Far more often, hospitality was a more meager, grudging affair. A curt nod, permitting him to sleep in a drafty outbuilding with the goats, or find a patch of floor in the main house far from the fire's warmth. A small bowl of thin porridge, or a hunk of stale bread offered silently, perhaps with averted eyes, making it clear this was charity offered out of obligation or fear of refusing a man of potential spiritual power, rather than genuine welcome. And sometimes, as we know, hospitality was denied altogether, leaving him entirely reliant on his own resources, or lack thereof. The constant uncertainty of reception, welcome, tolerance, suspicion, outright hostility, added another layer of anxiety to every approach towards a settlement. Beyond immediate food and shelter, if he performed a particularly valued service, mediating a complex land dispute between two powerful families and reaching a judgment seen as wise, or at least preventing bloodshed, delivering a stunningly accurate prediction about the weather that saved the harvest, or perhaps easing the chieftain's agonizing gout with a carefully prepared herbal poultice when nothing else had worked, he might receive a more tangible gift. This wasn't payment in a commercial sense, but a traditional offering acknowledging his skill and favor. It might be a measure of precious grain, barley, oats, to carry with him, heavy but vital. Perhaps a length of newly woven woolen cloth, coarse but warmer than his own disintegrating tunic. Maybe a useful tool, a small sharp knife, a new pair of sturdy leather wrappings for his constantly aching feet, a less cracked clay pot for cooking, or even a precious whetstone to keep his ritual sickle sharp. Occasionally, it might be something more symbolic but still valuable, a polished jet bead, an amber pendant, items believed to hold protective power. But just as often, the gift might be trivial, almost insulting. A handful of wilted vegetables, a worn-out tool barely better than his own. And carrying these gifts presented its own problems. Bulky items added to his burden. Food could spoil or attract pests. Consistency was non-existent. The value of his payment depended entirely on the perceived success of his service, the current mood and prosperity of the host, local customs, and whether he'd inadvertently offended some powerful local taboo or faction without even realizing it. And coin? Shiny Roman denarii, stamped with the emperor's increasingly arrogant face, or even the older, cruder silver or potin coinage sometimes used by Gallic tribes themselves. Forget it, mostly. While Druids associated with major tribal centers, or those involved in large-scale political negotiations, might occasionally handle currency, for the average wanderer operating in a largely subsistence and barter-based rural economy, coin was rare. Payment was in things needed for immediate survival: food, shelter, basic goods. Wealth was measured in cattle, land, influence, not necessarily in portable metal discs. Furthermore, there might have been a philosophical or traditional reluctance among some Druids to engage too deeply with the crass materialism represented by Roman money, seeing their own value as residing in knowledge and spiritual connection, not economic transactions. Though one suspects our cold, hungry Druid might have happily traded a complex cosmological insight for a handful of silver to buy a decent meal and a dry cloak, given the chance. Deductions. Oh, the creative accounting wasn't handled by scribes with wax tablets, but by circumstance, human nature, and the ever-present possibility of failure. Render an unpopular judgment in a property dispute, officiate a ritual that happens to coincide with the prize bull being struck by lightning, or the chieftain's wife running off with a passing merchant. Your expected hospitality, let alone any tangible gift, might abruptly evaporate like mist in the morning sun. You might find yourself suddenly and strongly encouraged to appreciate the scenic beauty of the surrounding forest. At night, immediately. Payment wasn't guaranteed. It was contingent, precarious, a constant gamble. Feast or famine was the rule, but mostly it was just variations on not quite enough. a persistent state of economic vulnerability that mirrored the uncertainty of the journey and the environment itself. This precariousness highlighted a grand, cosmic, and likely deeply frustrating irony woven into the very fabric of his existence. Here he was, a living repository of the tribe's laws, history, sacred traditions, and complex calendar. He might be called upon to advise powerful chieftains on matters of war, peace, and alliances, decisions affecting the lives and livelihoods of thousands. His judgments in disputes could determine the fate of families, the ownership of vast tracts of land and herds of cattle. He understood the intricate dance of the stars, the subtle language of the earth and its seasons, the genealogies stretching back to mythical ancestors which legitimized ruling families. In short, he was, in theory, indispensable, a pillar upholding the very structure of Gallic society, the intellectual and spiritual lifeblood of his people, the guardian of their identity. And for performing this collection of absolutely pivotal roles, he was often rewarded with a social status that might be outwardly respectful in formal settings. People might quieten when he spoke on matters of lore, but often translated in practical, day-to-day economic terms into something akin to a respected but perpetually impoverished wandering scholar. He moved among people making decisions about significant material wealth, land boundaries, cattle distribution, tribute payments, spoils of war, yet his own personal possessions usually amounted to little more than the threadbare robes on his back, his trusty staff, his ritual tools, and the contents of his leaky pouch. He might advise on the equitable distribution of wealth, or judge complex property disputes according to ancient law, while his own stomach rumbled with hunger and his feet ached from inadequate footwear. He was a conduit for wisdom that shaped the community, but often a recipient of mere scraps from its table. The yawning disconnect between the immense value of his societal function and the frequently meager, unreliable reward he received was a constant, silent, perhaps internally screamed commentary on the priorities of the world he navigated. The absurdity of mediating a dispute over 50 head of cattle while personally owning nothing but a headache and damp socks must have struck him on occasion. His already precarious economic existence was further buffeted by the unpredictable whims of gods, nature, and increasingly, the heavy hand of Rome. A good harvest, driven by favorable weather, perhaps nudged along by timely rituals he performed, enhancing his temporary prestige, meant villages might be slightly more prosperous, food stores fuller, and hosts perhaps a bit more generous with their hospitality. More work for him too, certainly, blessing fields and newly filled granaries, but not necessarily a guarantee of significantly better or more reliable support. Conversely, a bad harvest, caused by drought, flood, or unseasonable storms, meant hardship, famine, desperation, and suspicion. Communities turned inward, hoarding resources. Charity evaporated. Blame might even fall on the Druid for failing to appease the relevant deities. Less work available perhaps, and drastically reduced ability or willingness among starving communities to support a wandering spiritual specialist. Generosity dries up faster than a puddle in summer when people fear for their own survival. Then there were the turbulent political winds, endemic intertribal warfare, a near constant feature of pre-Roman and even Roman-era Gaul, created a fluctuating demand for war omens, ritual protections for warriors, and strategic advice based on portents. However, it also made travel infinitely more dangerous, disrupted traditional routes and support networks, and could obliterate the very communities he relied upon for sustenance. Getting caught between warring factions was a recipe for disaster. And the growing, inexorable shadow of Rome? That changed the entire economic and social equation. Roman conquest didn't just mean battles and bloodshed. It meant the imposition of Roman administration, heavy taxation that drained tribal wealth and surplus, leaving less for traditional patronage, confiscation of land for veterans or imperial estates, and the deliberate suppression of Druidic practices seen as politically subversive and religiously barbaric. Patronizing a known druid could become dangerous for Gallic nobles seeking favor or avoiding trouble with the Roman authorities. Roman roads, while perhaps making travel physically easier in some areas, also facilitated the movement of legions and officials deeply suspicious of his kind and could bypass traditional tribal centers and sacred sites, further marginalizing his role. The rise of a Romanized Gallo-Roman elite, more interested in classical education, Roman law, and Mediterranean luxury goods, might have less time or resources for traditional Druidic services, viewing them as rustic, outdated, or even politically unwise. A chieftain's grand idea for a new defensive earthwork against rivals, or Romans, or a costly campaign requiring tribute and manpower. That meant resources were diverted, leaving little left over for supporting itinerant priests or scholars. He wasn't just subject to the fluctuations of the harvest. He was caught in the powerful, often destructive, tides of history, warfare, and imperial expansion, which rarely washed anything good onto his particular shore. Getting paid consistently was never really on the table. Simply surviving the intertwined economic, political, and environmental chaos was the real, relentless challenge. His economic reality wasn't just precarious. It was structurally designed to be so, a fundamental aspect of the Wandering Druid's profound suck. So, after enduring near constant poverty, imminent peril, progressive physical decay, questionable sanitation, and the dubious joys of navigating complex human interactions, perhaps our weary wanderer could look forward to finishing, clocking out for good, reaching the end of the pilgrimage trail, hanging up his sickle, and settling down to enjoy a well-deserved retirement of quiet contemplation, and maybe finally getting his feet properly dry. Not a chance. Not even close. The concept of finishing the job, of reaching a final terminus where the work was done, was perhaps the most alien and unattainable concept of all in the relentless cyclical existence of a wandering druid. It wasn't a job with defined projects and completion dates. It was a perpetual state of being, an obligation woven into the fabric of time itself. It wasn't a linear journey with a clear destination. It was a great grinding wheel, perpetually turning through seasons and landscapes, and he was bound to it, destined to walk its circumference until he fell. The idea of finishing for the day was already a quaint, often theoretical notion, usually just an enforced pause, dictated by impenetrable darkness, utter exhaustion, or the arrival of weather too severe even for him to travel through. It merely marked the transition from the miseries of travel to the different, sometimes more intense, miseries and anxieties of the night. And finishing a specific journey, reaching a particularly renowned sacred grove, perhaps the great forest of the Carnutes, believed by some, according to Caesar anyway, to be the center of Gaul and the location of an annual Druidic assembly. A significant milestone, certainly, a place of power and perhaps reunion, but rarely, if ever, a final stopping point. You might spend weeks, even months, walking arduous miles, navigating treacherous mountain passes or dense, disorienting forests, enduring miserable weather and uncertain welcomes, finally arriving to perform the necessary seasonal rites, mediate disputes that had been simmering for generations, consult with local elders, or perhaps participate in solemn assemblies with other druids. You might spend a few days or even weeks within the relative, and probably still quite basic, comfort and security of that place, catching up on sleep debt, unlikely to ever be fully repaid, maybe getting a few decent meals, a rare treat, fulfilling your complex ritual and judicial duties. And then, you wouldn't be handed a severance package and wished well in your retirement. You'd simply consult your internal map, that vast, complex tapestry of paths, groves, settlements, and obligations stored in your memory. Shoulder your meager pouch, grip your staff, and begin the trek towards the next grove on the circuit, the next tribal center requiring intervention, the next place where custom, obligation, seasonal timing, or troubling rumor dictated your presence was required. The sacred geography of Gaul wasn't a single destination. It was an intricate network, a living web of significant places. Ancient groves with gnarled, moss-draped oaks, bubbling springs deemed sacred to local deities, weathered standing stones marking celestial alignments or burial sites. And his life was spent perpetually tracing and retracing the invisible threads connecting them. The path flowed in multiple directions, north, south, east, west, through forest and swamp, over hill and across river. And so, conveniently, did his misery, his responsibility, and his endless walking. One task bled seamlessly, relentlessly, into the next. Successfully judging a complex inheritance dispute, perhaps preventing a bloody feud between two powerful families, might immediately lead to a pressing request from one of the involved parties to divine the most auspicious time for a marriage alliance, or from the other party to provide ritual protection against perceived witchcraft. Performing the vital planting rituals in one village cluster, ensuring the community felt cosmically aligned for a successful growing season, simply meant it was now critically time to start the long walk towards the next agricultural region whose planting season was imminent. Officiating at the Beltane fires on May Day Eve, a festival marking the start of summer, perhaps at a major tribal gathering point, meant you then had a specific window to travel hundreds of miles to preside over harvest ceremonies or Lugnasad festivities in late summer somewhere else entirely. Then came Samhain, the threshold of winter, a time when the veil between worlds thinned, requiring solemn rites to honor the ancestors and appease potentially troublesome spirits, often held at specific burial mounds or liminal locations. Another deadline, another journey. Fixing one societal problem, like mediating a border dispute, often just revealed another lurking beneath it, like resentment over grazing rights. It was less a to-do list and more a vast, unending cycle of cosmic maintenance, legal arbitration, and crisis management. With him as the perpetually exhausted, perpetually mobile engineer, trying to keep the whole precarious system from collapsing. One ritual, one judgment, one wearying journey at a time. The list was simply suffer. Walk, observe, remember, perform arcane duties, walk some more, repeated infinitely until you could no longer walk, remember, or perform said duties effectively. His life was inextricably tethered to the grand, indifferent rhythms of the cosmos, the cycles of the sun, moon, and stars that dictated the sacred calendar, and the equally indifferent, though far more capricious and demanding, rhythms of human need, conflict, and agricultural necessity. The cycle of the moon dictated the precise timing for gathering certain potent herbs or performing specific divinations. The passage of the sun through the sky, tracked meticulously through observation of solstices and equinoxes at specific horizon markers, or standing stone alignments, marked the great hinges of the year, the four major fire festivals, Imbolc, Beltane, Lugnasad, Samhain, each requiring complex, location-specific observances to maintain harmony between the human world and the other world, ensuring fertility, prosperity, and protection. The agricultural calendar demanded blessings at planting, prayers during growth, and thanksgivings at harvest. The political calendar, such as it was, involved periodic tribal assemblies, councils of war, inauguration ceremonies for new chieftains, or legal gatherings where disputes were brought for judgment, all often requiring the authoritative presence and legitimizing function of druids. He was trapped in this intricate, demanding cycle, a human shuttlecock batted back and forth across the landscape by the inexorable demands of tradition, cosmology, and societal expectation. There was no escape hatch, no possibility of early retirement, no opting out to pursue a quiet life, crafting artisanal wicker furniture or composing poetry in a secluded hut, though he probably composed plenty of grim internal verses about the rain. His knowledge, his training, his very identity were inextricably bound to this path, He was the tradition, in a very real sense. To abandon the path would be to abandon himself, and potentially endanger the cosmic balance he was sworn to uphold. He was a vital cog in the great, creaking, often blood-splattered machine of Gallic spiritual, legal, and social life, destined to turn and grind along with it until he broke or wore out completely. The sheer, crushing endlessness of it, the profound lack of a final resolution or ultimate resting point, must have been a significant psychological weight, a constant, wearying awareness that the road truly did go on forever, or at least until his own legs finally gave out somewhere along its muddy, indifferent length. The horizon never got closer. It just revealed more road to travel. Now it would be a profound insult to his suffering, and frankly just dishonest storytelling, to suggest that this relentless, grinding cycle contained anything approaching conventional modern joy or happiness. His existence was largely defined by hardship, discomfort, pervasive anxiety, and profound physical weariness. Yet even submerged in the deepest, darkest pit of daily misery, the human spirit, that stubborn, irrational, often illogical flicker, can sometimes find the tiniest, most improbable crack of light. These weren't moments of bliss or contentment in any sense we'd recognize. They were more like fleeting, grim acknowledgments of survival against the odds, brief validations of skill or purpose, or momentary points of alignment in a predominantly chaotic and hostile world. The crucial 20% providing contrast, not pleasure. There might be a grim flicker of intense professional pride, almost instantly suppressed lest the gods or jealous spirits take notice and decide to teach him humility, when a particularly complex, multi-day ritual sequence went exactly according to ancient prescription, every gesture precise and meaningful, every intoned verse resonating with power, every participant guided flawlessly, feeling the weight and energy of tradition flow through him without a single misstep, sensing a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of connection achieved, balance restored. Or perhaps the quiet, intense satisfaction of accurately navigating through a notoriously confusing stretch of fog-bound forest using only subtle signs, the feel of the wind, the lean of the trees, the memory of a half-forgotten verse describing the route, and emerging precisely where intended, a small but significant victory of knowledge and attuned senses over the disorienting power of the wilderness. That felt good, in a grim, non-smiling sort of way. Maybe a moment of sharp, unexpected, almost painful beauty would briefly pierce the gray monotony, the way the rising sun suddenly broke through the mist in a remote valley, illuminating ancient standing stones and shafts of golden light, creating a scene so profound and otherworldly it seemed to momentarily transcend time and suffering. Or the sudden, breathtaking sight, deep within a protected grove, of a truly colossal, unimaginably ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching like arms towards the heavens, its very presence radiating immense power and endurance, briefly making his own struggles seem small and transient, connecting him to something vast, silent, and eternal. These weren't happy moments, but moments of awe, brief encounters with the sublime that recharged his spirit in some fundamental way, reminding him why these places, these traditions, mattered. Sometimes, relief came in simpler, more visceral forms. Reaching a planned destination, a known friendly settlement, before the forecasted torrential storm broke, hearing the first drops splatter just as he ducked under a welcoming, or at least not actively hostile roof, finding a spring of pure, clean, ice-cold water after hours of thirst on a hot day, drinking deeply until his teeth ached, receiving an unexpected offering of genuinely delicious, nourishing food, a piece of tender roasted boar, some honeycomb dripping with flavor, a warm loaf of bread made with actual skill instead of desperation, that tasted like ambrosia after weeks of gritty flatbread and foraged roots. Or perhaps sharing a rare moment of unguarded connection with another traveler, maybe even another druid met briefly on the path, culminating in a shared joke, likely about the sheer awfulness of the weather, the incompetence of a local chieftain, or the absurdity of Roman pretensions. a joke so dark, so steeped in shared misery, it would make a corpse wince. But the shared harsh laughter acknowledging the absurdity of their shared existence created a fleeting bond, a tiny spark of warmth in the pervasive cold. Maybe even the quiet satisfaction of successfully teaching a struggling apprentice a particularly difficult legal concept or ritual element, seeing the moment of understanding finally dawn in their eyes, a small victory in the vital task of passing the torch, or the deep quiet relief of successfully treating someone desperately ill with carefully prepared herbs, seeing the fever break or the wound begin to heal cleanly, knowing his knowledge had made a tangible difference. These weren't moments of joy in the modern sense. They were tiny, gasping breaths in an ocean of suffocation. Small affirmations that, despite everything the world threw at him, he was still here, still functioning, still capable, still carrying the immense weight of his calling along the endless, wearying road. Fleas of satisfaction, perhaps, found while meticulously grooming the perpetually mange-ridden dog of his daily life. Fleeting, but maybe just enough to keep him going. This relentless cycle, this endless journey etched onto the landscape and into his very bones, couldn't last forever. The human body, even one hardened by decades of abuse, eventually starts issuing invoices for past mistreatment, demanding payment with interest. And the Druidic path, like a cruel moneylender, always collects its debts. No one endures this forever, and the transition towards the end was rarely graceful or comfortable. Perhaps it started subtly. The walk between villages felt just a little longer each season. The steep climbs left him breathless more quickly. That chronic cough, once just an annoying winter companion, now rattled his chest persistently, echoing in the damp forest air. The arthritis that had been a nagging ache became a fiery torment, making gripping his staff or performing delicate ritual gestures an exercise in pure agony, his knuckles swelling like ill-formed lumps of wood. His eyesight, once sharp enough to spot a hawk on the wing or read omens in swirling clouds, grew dimmer, the edges of the world blurring slightly, making navigation more difficult and identifying distant figures, friend or foe, Roman or Celt, a matter of anxious guesswork. Maybe memory, his most crucial tool, the living library of laws, genealogies, and rituals he carried within him, began to fray at the edges. A verse momentarily forgotten, a name slipping just out of reach. Terrifying lapses for someone whose entire authority rested on perfect recall. He didn't exactly choose this life, and chances are, if he had a son or took on a designated apprentice, neither did the poor lad. As his own strength began its slow, inexorable wane, he'd look at the boy, wide-eyed, perhaps a bit resentful, struggling to keep up on the trail, struggling even more with the vast quantities of memorization, and a complex, bitter brew of emotions would churn within him. There was grim necessity, the undeniable need to pass on the sacred knowledge, to ensure the traditions didn't die with him. This wasn't just a job, it was a sacred trust. But hot on the heels of duty would come a wave of profound guilt, knowing he was essentially shackling this young life to the same leaking barge of an existence he had endured. He was offering not a bright future, but a legacy of damp feet, aching backs, political peril, and questionable meals. Congratulations, son. You've inherited an aching back and a lifetime supply of existential dread. He'd find himself barking instructions, demanding perfection in recitation, pushing the apprentice physically and mentally, just as his own mentor, old Brennus the Stern perhaps, had pushed him decades ago. Partly, it was the only way he knew. Partly, it was necessary. Mistakes in ritual or judgment could have dire consequences. But perhaps sometimes, seeing the fear or exhaustion in the boy's eyes, he'd feel a pang of something akin to pity, a sharp contrast to the stoic indifference he usually projected. He might see his own youthful misery reflected, and wonder briefly if there wasn't some other path. But the weight of tradition, the demands of the community, the lack of alternatives, would quickly crush such thoughts. The knowledge had to be passed on. The cycle had to continue. And so he'd push the boy harder, teaching him not just the lore, but the equally vital skill of endurance through suffering. And the boy would look back with those wide, youthful eyes, a mixture of fear, grudging respect perhaps, and the dawning, dreadful understanding that this precarious, exhausting, vital role was his glorious inheritance. Meanwhile, the older druid's own body continued its inevitable decline. The younger men in the villages, even his own apprentice, would start to outpace him on the trail. His pronouncements, perhaps lacking their former vigor or certainty, might be listened to with slightly less reverence. The chieftain's gaze, once seeking wisdom, might now hold a hint of impatience or calculation. He became slower, more vulnerable, less capable of the long, arduous journeys required to serve a wide region. The calculating look of a community leader evaluating a worn-out tool would become more frequent. There was no pension plan in the Druidic order, no retirement village nestled in a particularly tranquil grove. When you could no longer reliably recall the ancient laws, when your hands trembled too much for the intricate rituals, when you could no longer pull your own weight on the trail or command the respect needed to mediate disputes effectively, you became redundant. A mouth to feed without the hands or mind to fully earn it. If your successor was dutiful or compassionate, you might be cared for, given a corner to sit in, treated with a measure of respect due to your past service. But if resources were scarce, or your successor ambitious and impatient, or if you simply had no successor, you might be gently, or not so gently, cast aside, left reliant on the broader charity of a community that now saw you as a burden rather than an asset. The knowledge you carried was sacred, vital, but the vessel, once cracked and failing, that was often just old, disposable, a stark, unsentimental end to a life spent in service to forces seen and unseen, often culminating not in peaceful repose, but in quiet marginal obsolescence. So the cycle turns, the old druid fades, the new one takes up the staff, the burden, the endless walk, a life of hardship, often ending in obscurity, replaced by another life destined for the same. It's easy, looking back through the comfortable lens of centuries, to see only the misery, the damp, the danger, the profound suck of it all. And make no mistake, it did suck, profoundly and consistently. But is that the whole story? Is the wandering druid just another historical victim, ground down by circumstance? Perhaps not entirely. Chieftains like Vercingetorix raised armies, fought battles, their names carved, ironically often by their Roman conquerors, into the annals of history. Warriors clashed, tribes rose and fell, their deeds recounted in tales that likely grew taller with each telling. But beneath the shadow of every boastful chieftain, behind every charge of spear-wielding warriors, lay the unrecorded knowledge, the unseen influence, the quiet, persistent presence of figures like our wandering druid. He wore no crown, commanded no legions, amassed no treasure. His name isn't chiseled onto victory arches or moldering monuments. Yet, without his relentless, often thankless toil, memorizing the laws, mediating the disputes, placating the spirits, observing the heavens, advising the leaders, even the volatile ones, the very fabric of Gallic society, that complex, fractious, vibrant culture that Rome found both alluring and infuriating, would have unraveled much faster. He was the unseen sinew holding the bones together, the quiet memory bank preserving identity, the ant laboring tirelessly, invisibly, to maintain the cultural anthill. No statues were raised in his specific honor, though the standing stones he might have helped align or venerate still dot the European landscape, silent witnesses to forgotten rites. His footsteps, Countless millions trod across forest paths, muddy fields, windswept hills, and marshy lowlands, have long since been washed away by 2 millennia of rain and obscured by the plow and the motorway. His name, his specific deeds, that time he successfully healed the chieftain's favorite hound, the complex legal ruling that averted a war, the particular constellation he deciphered to predict a harsh winter, his personal hopes and fears, his moments of doubt and flashes of insight, have dissolved utterly into the damp earth he knew so intimately, leaving barely a trace for conventional history to grasp. His primary medium, the spoken word, the memorized verse, the chanted invocation, vanished into the air the moment it was uttered. Yet, his legacy, though largely invisible and notoriously difficult for historians to pin down definitively, is arguably woven into the deep cultural DNA of the lands he walked. It's perhaps there in the persistent folklore of Western Europe, tales of wise men dwelling in forests, magical springs, ancient curses, and the enduring power of nature. It's hinted at in the place names that echo ancient Celtic deities, or landscape features imbued with forgotten sacred significance. It might be subtly present in the deep-rooted reverence for certain ancient trees or natural sites that survived centuries of Christianization. Some argue its influence can even be detected in the unique flavor of early Celtic Christianity, with its emphasis on monastic learning, asceticism, connection to the natural world, and distinct liturgical practices, perhaps representing a partial fusion or adaptation of older indigenous spiritual sensibilities. He didn't just preserve arcane knowledge. He embodied and perpetuated a whole way of understanding the world, a worldview emphasizing cyclical time, the interconnectedness of all things, the importance of tradition and lineage, and a profound, intimate relationship between the human community and the rhythms and spirits of the natural landscape. This worldview, though its formal Druidic structure was eventually dismantled by Roman power and later absorbed or suppressed by Christianity, may have lingered, subtly shaping the cultural subconscious of the regions he served. He didn't just witness history from the damp, uncomfortable sidelines. He was actively engaged in shaping the cultural software, the deep-seated beliefs and assumptions, the operating system running silently beneath the more dramatic surface events of conquest and conversion, helping to shape how a people understood themselves and their place in the cosmos long after his name was forgotten. He physically, mentally, spiritually carried that understanding across the land, generation after wearying generation, a mobile node in a vast ancient network of knowledge. So, the next time you marvel at the resilience of ancient cultures, or perhaps find yourself walking through a particularly old, mist-shrouded forest, or contemplating the enigmatic presence of a weathered standing stone, spare a thought for the forgotten figure who likely knew such places intimately. The wandering Celtic Druid. Acknowledge the almost unimaginable hardship, the cold, the wet, the hunger, the fear, the pain, the crushing fatigue, the profound lack of comfort and security that defined his existence. He sought no glory as we understand it, and received precious little solace. Yet, in his unceasing labor against staggering odds, in his stubborn, bone-deep endurance, through conditions that would break most modern humans within weeks, in his unwavering dedication to preserving a universe of intricate knowledge within his own mind against the corrosive forces of time, forgetting, and violent suppression, he was profoundly more than just a sufferer, more than a mere victim of circumstance. He was a vital, though anonymous agent of cultural continuity, a living library walking the land, a flickering candle of ancient wisdom cupped protectively against the gathering storm of Roman imperialism and societal upheaval. His endurance was not merely passive survival. It was an active, ongoing act of profound cultural resistance and preservation. He wasn't just a drop in the relentless, muddy river of Gallic life. He was, in his own small, weary, incredibly tenacious way, a crucial part of its very will to endure, to remember, to adapt, to be. His name is forgotten, lost forever to the mist and the mud he knew so well. But the quiet echo of his chants, the enduring weight of the knowledge he carried, the sheer stubborn resilience he embodied, remains embedded deep within the soil and the soul of the lands he walked. A truly weary wanderer, perhaps, but one whose invisible contribution mattered.